Hello, welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. For a first for our podcast, I'm delighted to say we're joined by an esteemed guest from the finance community, and we're going to be exploring the thorny problem of measuring procurement savings. And I'm delighted to say that joining me for this discussion is Jim Davies. Jim is the Procurement Finance Director at BT Group, where he has been since 2016. Previously, he had roles at Barclays Investment Management and then more at International. Also, we're saying if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't already, I would definitely recommend going back and listening to one of our previous podcasts we recorded with Cyril Porat at BT Sourced, because it provides a really good companion piece, I think, to this discussion. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion this morning. And for many of our listeners, I think your role as Procurement Finance Director is a really interesting one, actually. So I wondered if we could perhaps start by understanding a little bit about your background and how you've ended up in that role at BT Group.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. And hopefully it will give listeners of your podcast a bit of a different perspective of the finance side. Obviously, lots of overlap, but the discussion will be of interest today. So my background, I was previously a sell-side equity analyst at Nomura, the Japanese investment bank, not by design, but ended up covering European telcos.
Okay.
And as part of that, got to know the team at BT Group. It was one of the stocks that I supported the coverage of. And I thoroughly enjoyed my time as a sell-side equity analyst. Could have had a long, enjoyable career doing that, I'm sure. But for me, I always felt I wanted to be more on the inside of companies and trying to make decisions that drive shareholder value rather than being on the outside looking in.
Right.
So that was the sort of longer term career idea. And the easiest way to sort of make the transition from being an analyst on the outside and into a company was by the investor relations team. So having known the team at BT Group, opportunity came up and I moved over into BT. And this was around 6.5 years ago. Spent 4 years really in the investor relations team at BT. Again, thoroughly enjoyed that time in the IR team. Very interesting role. There's an awful lot going on at BT Group over my time there. But again, for my career and what I wanted to move into a role, like I said before, sort of influencing and making decisions that drive shareholder value.
Yeah.
And that was when the Procurement Finance Director role was actually established. It didn't exist before. And this is about 2.5 years ago now. And it was clearly of interest to me. And I was fortunate to get the opportunity to work right across our group, but obviously work very closely with Cyril, whom you mentioned earlier on.
For me, the title Procurement Finance Director is an interesting one as well. It's not a role I personally seen a lot of. It would be really interesting to understand what exactly that role involves and perhaps what the logic was to create it if it hadn't been in BT Group before.
Yeah, great question, Simon. So really, when you boil it right down, it is to answer the quite knotty question or problem there. I'm sure many listeners of this podcast will be familiar with, of how do we consistently and comprehensively measure the performance of procurement teams in terms of the savings delivered, and then be able to track that in to the financial performance of each division or units, as we call them within BT Group. Simplistically, that's the big question that the role was created to, and therefore I was asked to answer. So that ultimately, the group CFO and our group financial planning analysis team, FP&A team, have that visibility right across. And the metaphor that we always use within the team, and as we've been going along through this journey of the last 2.5 years, has been peeling the onion. Every stage that you go through, you peel another layer and you find there's another aspect to the question or to the organizational problem, if you like, that we have to find a solution to.
Yeah. Jim, I'm intrigued. Prior to taking on this role, had you had much experience with procurement? Was it an area of the business you understood, or was it relatively new to you?
Relatively new, so next to no experience. So the bit I described before in terms of the IR role, I'd done that in terms of interfacing. So, worked with, met Cyril's predecessor a few times to try to understand what, that team was doing, and therefore we could communicate that externally. And also worked with some of the procurement teams in terms of trying to give them that wider organizational context of what's going on, in capital markets.
And I'm intrigued, did you have any kind of preconceptions about procurement when you came into the role, and perhaps to extend that, and what did you find when you started in this brand new role a couple of years ago?
I didn't have preconceptions. Cyril had not long joined BT Group.
Okay.
And probably go into this in more detail if it's helpful. But BT has been on a massive journey of transformation over several years, right across the board. BT's quite a complex organization in many ways. Every part of it is really being touched by transformation in some way.
Right.
And Cyril joined BT Group really to lead that from a procurement perspective.
Right.
And so in the few months that Cyril had joined before I came into this role, I had, of course, heard from him in terms of what he was trying to do with procurement, and so had that sort of bit of working knowledge. Probably the cleanest example of that is the work that Cyril did very early on and has really sort of followed through on since, to establish procurement digital garage, of bringing in a plethora of new tools as one of the ways by which to really transform procurement within the group.
BT's an enormous organisation. I mean, one of the biggest organisations in the UK, right? What did you find? What level of maturity were you kind of inheriting?
So actually, one of the things that I did fairly early on was we had some other external consultants working with us at the time, and that was actually chiefly around the creation of BT Source. And what I wanted to do was get an external view of, given I was quite new to procurement, get an external view of exactly that. How mature were we in terms of getting towards what good looks like? And the way it was framed by the external consultants we were working with at the time was a 5-step maturity, to go very simplistically from very little focus given on tracking savings, no consistency, and certainly no way to be able to add the numbers together for a consolidated group view. From that right through, step 1, right through to step 5, where absolute clarity on the savings being delivered, being able to map them very clearly into the cost plans and performance of each of the divisions, to the extent that you can then make decisions about how to adjust budgets as you go and effectively reallocate capital.
Yeah.
And to get there, as you go from 1 to 5, if you like, that's that peeling of the onion that I mentioned earlier on, because it's every step that you go up that, you find a new set of sort of organizational problems to solve. And in terms of where we were as a company, probably about 1.5. So about a step and a half, and therefore quite a way to go in terms of getting towards what good looks like.
So you started at the bottom end of that scale. How did you prioritize how you started to move up that? What's that experience been like?
There are a number of issues that, first start trying to diagnose the problem, if you like.
Yeah.
And there was a lack of consistency across our units. Each of the units themselves were at different levels of maturity. So some clearly had a good handle on the cost base being procured by the procurement function. Others had less of a grip on that. Different finance teams across the units, clearly many things to do, gave this different levels of prioritization. Some sort of, devolved it quite a lot to the procurement teams. Others were working much more closely with them. There was a very inconsistent set of data that we had, and that data often wasn't readily available. And so the combination of things I mentioned made it possible to consolidate a group view. And this led to, as I saw it, a couple of problems. One was that the procurement teams lacked credibility. They were often too keen to call out as big a savings number as possible.
Yes. Yeah.
Doing things like rolling 7 years worth of savings into 1 year because they've done a 7-year deal and count that all in the first year, counting cost avoidance and mixing that in with what we'd call a hard saving reduction. They had a lack of credibility on the part of the procurement teams. And then from a unit financial perspective, that the lack of clarity meant that a lack of control on some parts of the cost base, and therefore a relatively static cost base, mixed in with the opportunity or the propensity to use procurement savings that have been delivered on some third-party costs to discharge budget challenges elsewhere, which might be the thing makes sense from a individual unit perspective, but actually from with my mindset, previous roles, actually, the decision about where to effectively, to spend that saving, if you like, is to reallocate it to the area with the greatest prospects for return on capital, which may or may not be in the individual unit where the saving was delivered, if that makes sense.
Of course, yeah.
So you had the procurement teams clearly, working very, very hard every day, try to deliver, the best cost outcomes for the group. As were the unit financial teams. And actually quite remarkable the extent to which those two sets of teams didn't work together particularly closely a lot of the time.
Yeah, not uncommon.
And I'm sure this is a thing for many large organizations of working in splendid isolation of each other, when actually, greater coordination and collaboration could deliver a much better outcome for all involved.
Yeah. But Jim, I think there's a number of issues in there. I'm sure lots of our listeners would be and see is very common. Defining a saving, for example, is often a point of discussion, right?
Yeah.
Procurement colleagues would have one view, sometimes finance others. I'm really interested to get your perspective on that idea of even what a saving is, actually how you tackled that one, because that's one of the simplest, but also one of the most common.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we did relatively early on was we put a lot of work into defining what we call the procurement savings methodology. And, it was a real investment of time to set out and to be very, very clear about the counting methodology, the terminology. And this is a really important point that I've from previous experience of different teams will be talking about the same thing but using different language, and very simplistically then gets in the way of being aligned and solving that coordination problem. So clear methodology, which I can come on to in a moment, clear, precise terminology, as well as the methodology for counting an individual initiative, being clear about the life cycle that initiative, that a single piece of procurement work, if you like, should go through, and therefore understanding how that then can map into financial performance, and being clear about the planning cycle and how that should fit into the wider pre-existing financial planning cycle that we have as a group, and the reporting of the financial savings, etc. So quite a few bits in there, and the investment of time to get a very intellectually robust way of doing all of that, because we're effectively using the same data to do different things. That same data to both measure procurement performance, but also to explain financial performance, as well as incentivizing and rewarding performance of the procurement teams. The clearest way to explain the methodology is we tried to make it as simple as possible. Previous attempts to do this have been made. 60 pages of a savings handbook, and 60 pages is so much that people wouldn't even just sit on a digital bookshelf, wouldn't even engage with it. I managed to boil this down onto effectively a single page, have that single page, and effectively use that to, that sort of simplicity to explain the principle. And then the sort of shifts then the tricky part of it is how you apply that to all the individual instances. Obviously that's why it then took considerable effort to do, but as a starting point, really clarifying that intellectually robust methodology on a page, so that we could then go and really put that into action. And the way that we settled on doing this was to refer to the hard savings and soft savings. Hard savings being those that improve cost-based performance, and soft savings being those that merely maintain cost-based performance.
Do you prioritize hard savings over soft? Did you look to have targets against both?
No, we don't prioritize, because in terms of how we are incentivizing and measuring the performance of the procurement teams, because there's clear recognition that, especially in a macroeconomic environment like the one that we're facing now, there's huge value to the company of it just being able to maintain cost-based performance, when you're faced with massive inflationary pressures. So from a principles perspective, no, we don't. From a pragmatic perspective of effectively building everything from scratch over the last 2 years, by necessity, we did have to prioritize, and the prioritization that we made was to focus on the measurement of hard savings.
Jim, I'm really intrigued you mentioned it, but in a present highly inflationary environment, a whole generation of people that have never worked in that. Have you seen this topic change as a result of that? Is there more focus on it? Interested in your perspective.
Absolutely. So now, about halfway through the second year of having everything in terms of the savings reporting, planning, and reviewing together, a year and a half into having that set up. The first year that we had, so our last financial year, it was by pragmatic necessity that we prioritized the hard savings. The plan was always that we would very much, shift our focus, and there's various ways we were going to do that. And concurrently, you've obviously had the macroeconomic environment as well, which has made it even more important. So from a sort of process perspective of standing up what we've been trying to do, we were bringing that in anyway. And then what we've seen that now that we did that halfway through last financial year, what we've seen this year as we've gone through is that the hard savings are more difficult to come by, but we're seeing a commensurate uptick in the soft savings that are being delivered. And so you can very clearly see that the impact that we're very able now to measure, that impact that you would sort of naturally expect given the environment at the moment.
Jim, one of the things you said I thought was really interesting. You talked about the measurement of savings, but you also talked about the collaboration between effectively finance colleagues and procurement colleagues, which is, again, is a very common conversation issue that people in our industry discuss. I can absolutely see the need for that collaboration, but I'm also interested, presume there is a level of healthy tension between the two as well, right? I'm interested in your perspective on that, right?
Yeah. What I want to do is effectively transform the role of procurement within BT Group. And a couple of parts of that transformation. One is within inside the procurement function. And then the second is, and that goes with the use of digital tools, trying to bring in new colleagues from different industries, different backgrounds, new ways of thinking. So within the procurement function, and then the procurement function with the rest of BT Group. And that second part, the role of procurement within BT Group, one of the things that always surprised me very early on was you would have finance teams referring to cost and the procurement teams referring to spend, as though the two things were completely different. Right. And so I always used to think of this as being, they're effectively two sides of the same coin. And not different coins. That mindset has obviously been something that we've been trying to establish to a greater extent across some of the parts of the group. Now clearly, it was already there. I think we've played a massive role in terms of the procurement finance side of really being able to drive that. But like I said before, bringing that sort of financial clarity to frame the discussion between the procurement teams and the unit teams, not just the finance teams, but obviously their operational counterparts, has really helped. It's the oil that helps with the friction, if you like. That is the way I often think about it.
Makes a lot of sense. And Jim, probably my last question. You mentioned at the start you were 1.5 on the ladder of maturity MG. Did you know where you are at this point in time? And then really, for anyone listening to this conversation who is at the bottom of that and they're about to start to think about this topic, any kind of key bits of advice or steer that you would give them?
So after we've been up and running for a year, so this was earlier this calendar year, so that would have been around April time. We sat down as a procurement finance team and got that 5-stage maturity back on the screen and had a look at where we were. And I think after a year, we moved about 2.5 to 3. And the massive achievement that we had in our last financial year, which for BT Group ends 31st of March, was to bring real clarity to the procurement side of the coin.
Yeah.
So methodology that we'd established, and then really the application of that methodology to getting on for 700 plus individual initiatives and being able to measure their hard savings and soft savings impacts on last financial year on an in-year basis, and then the amount of that benefit that flown through into this financial year. So we'd had done very, very well there, and that had really moved us up that maturity step. The part that remained to be done, and that we've made a lot of progress on since, albeit it's been a bit slower at times, is being able to reliably and consistently across all of our units, and therefore from a group perspective, track those savings into unit financial performance. And various reasons why that's been a bit slower going. There's been some fantastic work done by the team in recent months, and we're not far off being able to do that. We are, as a company as well, also heading towards our annual financial planning cycle as well. We stood up a brand new process last year to bring much better clarity and interlock from a planning perspective between the procurement teams and the unit teams, so that everyone's crystal clear on the savings targets, both hard savings, soft savings, OPEX, CAPEX, by category, by each of our 7 units as well, so that we've got the right accountabilities and responsibilities in place to then drive against that performance through this year. So we made huge amounts of progress in that, and sort of had the clearest plan that I think we probably ever had as a group. We're just entering into the next cycle for this year, and that's a big opportunity again to really work with our colleagues in the finance teams to drive even greater clarity around the planning, and shift much more of an iterative process rather than a procurement teams developing their plans for some savings, units developing their financial plans that reflect their strategies, but again, not having sufficiently early or detailed or deep enough conversations about the two things to then figure out, therefore, what can we do together to develop the most appropriately stretching plans, for our substantial cost base. The creation of my role on a relatively large, in many ways, team. So establishing, giving it proper focus, as I think, we did by, establishing a team with sole responsibility of this. Another one of the important things we've done is we are what I call a neutrally based team. So we're part of our central group finance team. We're therefore not part of the procurement organisation. We're not part of any of the units. Another aspect not mentioned is don't underestimate the quality of the data. So we work with software developers to effectively create a database system pretty much from scratch, designed to completely reflect our savings methodology and to store all of the information that we needed it to, so that we can use that same single source of truth to answer or to measure incentivized procurement performance, but then also the cost-based performance. And again, it probably sounds like a relatively simple thing. It really wasn't to establish, but having that single source of truth available to all colleagues that they can look at, and it's not different teams holding the data for themselves, very, very transparent. And the last thing I'd probably say about further organizations starting out on this journey, be prepared. You're going to have to be quite resilient. We've had to basically go from, as a newly created team, first justifying the existence of the team. On the procurement side, having to shift a mindset away from claiming the biggest number possible to one that was, much narrower definition, but was much more robust in the definition. And the real benefit of what we did with the team when we established it from scratch, tried to bring a real diversity of thought and backgrounds. So we put a lot of effort into that when recruiting, having that diversity of thought, etc.
Yeah. Jim, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's great to talk about procurement savings with a finance colleague. I'm sure for our listeners is really informative. So yeah, really appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Tom, thanks very much for having me. It's been great to talk.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please click the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also absolutely love to hear your views. So please do leave us a review on those platforms, or indeed send me a message on LinkedIn. And we'll be back soon for another discussion with senior industry figures.